Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It's late afternoon in a medieval town, and the smell of boiled herbs, river mud, unwashed bodies, and spiced ales settles into the stone alleys like an old friend. Somewhere near the market square, past the fishmongers and the tanner's yard, you find a low building with steam leaking through the shutters. A battered wooden sign swings above the door. Painted on it is a picture of a large wooden tub and a woman holding a ladle. The words, most can't read them anyway. This is a stew house, or, more commonly, just a stew. To the medieval mind, a stew is not just a meal. It is a place, a hot, wet, social place. A place for sweat, for healing, for talking, for eating, for doing things that probably shouldn't be done while naked in public. Stews are where townsfolk go to bathe, but bathing, in the medieval sense, is not quite what we understand it to be. You don't bathe to get clean. You bathe to stay moist. That might sound strange, but in the medieval world, viewed bleak influence by Galenic medicine balance of the humors was everything. A dry body was unhealthy. A dry temperament could mean an imbalance of phlegm, blood, yellow bile, or black bile. Moisture was good. A bath drew out impurities. It didn't scrub off, dirt it, coaxed it out with heat, oils, and time. In towns like London, Paris, and Cologne, bathhouses lined the banks of rivers, both for their water supply and for their symbolism. Water was holy. Water healed. And so, across social classes, people stepped into these stew houses, men and women, tradesmen and clergy, all seeking the mystical comfort of warm water and steam. But let's walk inside. You push open the warped wooden door, and the heat hits you. Damp, thick, herbal. The floor is slick with splashed water and errant meat drippings from a side table. Towels more like rough linen rap song on pegs. At the center are tubs, deep wooden barrels large enough for 2 or 3 bodies. Some are occupied. A cooper stirs a pot of hot stones to warm the bathwater. Thin girl with a mole on her cheek offers you a choice of infusions: rosemary and thyme, sage and vinegar, or beer and mint. You choose rosemary. It's supposed to draw out demons from under the skin. You are escorted to your tub. The wood is stained from decades of use. It smells like moss, and underfoot, you feel the slime of 1,000 previous bathers. The water is hot, hotter than you expect. You sit down. Steam curls around your nostrils. Someone nearby is singing a hymn. Someone else is eating a roasted eel. This, right now, is the medieval idea of wellness. Bathing was not always separated by gender. In many towns, it was quite normal for men and women to bathe together, though rules would shift depending on the local bishop's mood. Often, a linen cloth was draped across the middle of a shared tub to create a visual boundary. Whether that boundary was respected is another matter entirely, because stew houses were not just for bathing. They were also places of social bonding, business, and often of pleasure. It wasn't uncommon for people to eat their supper in the tub, to discuss contracts, to propose marriages, or, more notoriously, to hire prostitutes. In many cases, bathhouses doubled as brothels, or at least implied that possibility. The lines between clean and dirty, literal and metaphorical, were always blurred. And yet, the church didn't fully object. In fact, monks and priests bathed too. Many ecclesiastical records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain references to baths being used to prepare the body for prayer. To bathe was, in theory, to purify the soul. A bishop might publicly condemn bathing on Sundays, but privately enjoy the rosemary tub on Mondays. But here's the problem. The stew water doesn't get changed very often. Most bathhouses did not have sophisticated drainage systems. The water would be reused between patrons or topped off with fresh, heated river water. Scalding stones were dropped into the tub to raise the temperature, often splashing pathogens from person to person. World without microbiology. The idea of germs didn't exist. Illness was believed to come from miasmas or bad air. But stew houses smelled good, so they felt safe. They weren't. Records from medieval hospitals note outbreaks of skin lesions, boils, and strange rashes traced to bathhouses. The very place meant to draw out the sickness may have been incubating it. Communal sweating, eating, and casual bodily contact created ideal environments for staphylococcus, scabies, and even early strains of tuberculosis in London. The stews of Southwark were legendary. The district across the river from the city proper was full of vice, bear-baiting pits, alehouses, theaters, and stews. In 1161, King Henry II officially licensed the stews. Recognizing their usefulness, but also trying to regulate them, owners were required to be female. Hours were to be controlled. No one was to be forced into sex work, and patrons were to leave their weapons at the door. But enforcement was loose. Punishments were rare. And so the stews continued to flourish, humid, fragrant, and vaguely dangerous. There were benefits to the stews, of course. Bathing did help with lice. Warm water did soothe joint pain. Herbal infusions could ease skin infections, and some midwives used warm baths to assist with difficult births. But the line between healing and harm was often unclear. Now imagine visiting the stews during an outbreak. During times of plague or the pestilence, as it was often called, many bathhouses shut down. Others stayed open, believing that heat would drive the poison from the blood. Patrons were encouraged to rub their bodies with onions, vinegar, or their own urine before entering. In some places, sweating houses were established hot rooms where infected individuals were made to perspire violently in the hope of expelling death through the skin. Unsurprisingly, these houses often became centers of contagion. The logic, though faulty by modern standards, made a strange kind of sense. If disease was believed to arise from imbalance, then restoring balance through heat, through sweat, through moisture was the key. That many people got sicker from these practices was interpreted not as failure, but as fate. You might be wondering, why did people keep going? Because it felt good. The warmth, the smells, it's a brief escape from a drafty cottage or labor in the fields. Even if it was dangerous, it was pleasurable. And in a world where death came quickly from childbirth, from toothache, from fever, pleasure mattered, especially if it came in a form of hot water and rosemary. Today, the idea of bathing with strangers in a giant shared tub filled with old stew water might sound like a nightmare, but for the medieval bather, it was a small luxury, a sacred escape, a way to forget, if only for an hour, the smell of the tanner's yard and the bite of the cold. And that leaves us with a question. If you lived in a medieval town, would you risk the stew tub? Would the promise of comfort outweigh the risk of infection? Would you survive a medieval bath day? Or would you leave with more than just warm skin? The bathhouse, as you've come to realize, is not just a place to get clean. It's a space of negotiation, a low-lit theater of whispers, glances, bargains, and unwritten rules. In the warm, fragrant gloom of the stew tub, medieval society unfolds, not in royal courts or monastic scriptoriums, but in damp, steamy silence punctuated by coughs and casual laughter. You sit a little lower in your tub, water sloshing at your chest. The herbs have long since wilted. Your skin is pruny, but the conversation around you continues. A local baker is negotiating a flour shipment with a traveling merchant. Two women are gossiping about a priest's mysterious absences. Across the room, a young man is singing a tale of a knight who got lost in a bathhouse and never came out. It's funny because it could be true. In an age when privacy was scarce, the bathhouse became a strange refuge for secrets. Stew houses were one of the few places where people from different classes and trades could meet under vaguely equal terms. A nobleman might sit shoulder to shoulder with a leather worker. A monk might soak beside a butcher. Nakedness, oddly enough, leveled the social field, but that doesn't mean hierarchy disappeared. Bath attendants, often young boys or enslaved individuals, bustled through the stew house with jugs of hot water and trays of food. Their presence reinforced the pecking order. Wealthier bathers demanded warmer water, stronger herbs, better meat. To poor F, they could afford the bath fee at all shared crowded tubs, reused towels, and thinner broths. In some towns, the poorest citizens weren't allowed in at all. Stews charged entry fees, and even the cheapest baths were out of reach for many laborers. In 14th century London, for example, a typical bath might cost a halfpenny to enter, not much by modern standards, but enough to buy food for a day. The idea of bathing for health was a privilege. That privilege came with risk. By the time the Black Death swept across Europe in 1347, communal bathing was already under scrutiny. Physicians warned that open pores made the body vulnerable to infection. The act of bathing heating the body, relaxing the muscles. Flushing the skin was thought to invite disease in rather than push it out. In some texts, even water itself was blamed. It was too volatile, too changeable, too capable of carrying spirits or rot. Yet, people kept bathing. Why? Because it felt like something. The world was spinning with plague, famine, and war. Bathing offered agency. You could choose to sit in a warm tub with fragrant oils. You could sweat out your sins. For a moment, pretend to control your fate. The church had mixed feelings about this. Some monastic orders, especially the Cistercians and Cluniacs, encouraged regular bathing once a month, sometimes more. Cleanliness, after all, was associated with spiritual purity. But other orders found bathing dangerous to the soul. Too much comfort bred vanity. The naked body was a temptation. Bathhouses became battlegrounds of theology and lust. This tension played out in city ordinances, too. In places like Florence, Cologne, and Avignon, bathhouses were strictly regulated or banned outright. In the late 1300s, the Council of Basel condemned stews as places of corruption, claiming that the bath is a house not of washing, but of sign. Still, bans rarely lasted. The population wanted baths, needed them. And so stews returned, often under new names, with new rules, but the same warm water. You shift in your seat. A rat scurries along the baseboard. The fire near the water heating stones crackles. An older man next to you stirs a pot of lavender in the water with a stick. He tells you in a voice that sounds like gravel soaked in ale that he once bathed in a noble's house, an actual stone tub, lined with linen, with its own fireplace underneath. That, he says, was the cleanest I ever felt. And the dirtiest, too. He doesn't elaborate. Bathing in homes was rare. Only the wealthiest households could afford the materials. Large tubs, portable stoves, clean linens, oils, scented waters. Royalty bathed, of course, but even they did so infrequently. In 14th century France, King Louis IX was known to bathe every Saturday. This was considered excessive. His courtiers bathed once a month or on special feast days. Many lords bathed on the eve of tournaments or religious festivals, not for cleanliness, but for ceremony. Public bathhouses, by contrast, were daily life, and they had to evolve by the late 1400s. Some stews began to introduce individual tubs of luxury that reduced the spread of disease. Others created private rooms where small groups could bathe without mingling with the crowd. These changes reflected a growing awareness of health, but also a rising discomfort with communal nudity. At the same time, physicians started to write manuals on proper bathing. Books like De Balnees Putiolanas on the baths of Puzawali described the therapeutic uses of mineral waters. Others listed herbs and oils to treat melancholy, gout, or infertility. Bathing became, in some circles, medicalized. Doctors offered bath prescriptions, how long to soak, what to mix in, when to emerge, but most people didn't read these books. They listened to word of mouth. A woman might bathe with fennel to cleanse her womb. A man might soak in mustard water to invigorate his blood. A child with nightmares might be dipped in a warm milk bath and sprinkled with rose ash. Remedies were regional. Bathing was folk medicine, and it wasn't always safe. You overhear someone whispering about a woman who fainted in the bathhouse last week. Too much bloodletting. Someone mutters, she bathed too soon after. Another man says she was possessed. A third claims she was with child, and the bath drew it out too early. The bathhouse is filled with these stories. In Prague, Stuart reportedly drowned in a tub after drinking too much mulled wine. In Ghent, a stew caught fire when a heating stone cracked and sparked nearby straw. In York, an entire family was poisoned after bathing in water contaminated by tannery runoff. These aren't urban legends, letters, court records. The bath was a place of healing, yes, but also of hazard. You sit up, your skin is wrinkled and red. A young girl brings you a bowl of pottage and a small loaf of bread, cute in silence, dripping onto the wooden rim of the tub. This might be the only hot meal you get this week. It tastes like onion and barley. There's a sweetness to it, figs, maybe, or overripe pears. Outside, a bell rings. It's the call for vespers. Some bathers rise and towel off. Others ignore it. You stay seated because in the stew house, time slows. It thickens like the steam under glass windows. The world outside, the cold wind, the crowded streets, the daily hunger, it fades. For a while, this is enough, but you wonder, how long can this last? In the changing attitudes of cities and churches, you sense a shift. You're not in the bathhouse anymore. It's been weeks since your last visit. The air in the village has grown cooler, autumn's chill curling through the alleyways, rustling the tired vines that clamber across the crumbling stone walls. The days grow shorter, and so too does your patience for the aches that have crept into your joints. You remember the heat of the water, the comfort, the way your body felt after soaking for an hour or two, and yet, you haven't gone back. Not since. The man with the crooked shoulder was found dead in his bed 3 days after bathing. They say it was just a fever. Others whisper it was punishment for being too close, too exposed, letting meet flesh in water meant for souls. The village priest has started preaching against the baths. Not loudly, not at first. It's just quiet comments tucked between sermons. Little warnings. It's not about disease, about sin. It begins with modesty. Of course it does. The church had long held reservations about the public bathhouses, not because of hygiene or science, but because of what they symbolized: nakedness, idleness, and temptation. It was said that where there was heat, there was indulgence, and where there was indulgence, the devil was never far behind. The idea of public cleanliness had become, slowly, entwined with spiritual dirtiness. This shift wasn't sudden. It took centuries, but the consequences were real. Over time, bathhouses, once bustling centers of warmth, healing, and social bonding, became shadowed by suspicion. In 12th and 13th century Europe, bathhouses were ordinary. People of all classes used them. Some even owned private tubs if they were wealthy enough. Bath attendants were respected for their knowledge of herbs and heat. It was a strange kind of science, instinctive, passed down through generations. Baths were often located near natural hot springs, believed to possess divine properties. Some were associated with saints. Healing miracles were even said to have occurred in them. But by the 15th century, things began to change. The Black Death had rolled across the continent again and again. Whole villages disappeared. Monasteries stood silent. Fields went and tilled. With each wave of pestilence came new theories, new fears. People began to associate water with weakness. The opening of pores, once considered therapeutic, was now feared as a gateway for the miasmas, the bad airs thought to carry plague. Worse, some bathhouses had acquired reputations beyond health. In cities like Paris, London, and Prague, bathhouses became linked to prostitution. In Germany, the word Badstube bathhouse began to appear in legal documents beside terms for brothels. The line between cleansing and pleasure blurred, and in a deeply religious society, pleasure without piety was a dangerous thing. It wasn't just the church. Governments also began to react. The rise of city regulation brought stricter codes for public establishments. Bathhouse operators were taxed. Surveillance increased. During times of plague, many bathhouses were shut down entirely. The Great Drying had begun. In some cities, bathhouses fell into disrepair. The water no longer flowed warm. The wooden tubs warped. Herbs withered on windowsills. People stopped coming. Fear, suspicion, and a growing sense of spiritual danger kept them away. And so, paradoxically, as Europe moved into the Renaissance, with its fascination for anatomy, the human body, and classical ideals of health, the everyday habit of bathing began to vanish. We must pause here, because it seems absurd, ridiculous. Even the very act that had brought comfort and health became condemned, and what replaced it was not something new. It was something emptier. People started to believe that washing too often was bad for the body, that water stripped away vital oils, that it opened the skin to corruption. Linen became the new soap. Changing undergarments frequently was seen as a replacement for bathing. Queen Elizabeth I, it is said, bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not. Peasants stopped washing, except when the dirt became unbearable. City dwellers might go a year without touching warm water. Perfumes boomed in popularity. Too, wigs became fashionable, in part to mask the realities of lice and filth. And yet, amidst all this, some people still remembered. In the countryside, old bathhouses stood like ghosts. In a quiet glen, steam might still rise from a forgotten spring. A shepherd might slip off his boots and ease his feet into a stream warmed by ancient minerals. A midwife might still boil rosemary in a pot and use the scented water to bathe a newborn child. Traditions lingered, hidden beneath the new rituals of fear and modesty. The bath, though banished, was not dead. Even in cities, there were those who rebelled quietly. Humanists and physicians of the late Renaissance began to write treatises on the body, on the importance of cleanliness, even of water. Some cities reopened their bathhouses, not public ones, but medical baths, reserved for the ill and supervised closely. They were no longer places of community, but of treatment, and over time, as the Enlightenment dawned, attitudes shifted again. Scientific thinking reemerged. The discovery of germs, though still far off, began to take shape. Slowly, the miasma theory gave way to new understandings. Cleanliness returned not as a sin, but as a sign of civilization. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the bath had been reborn, but it had changed. It's no longer a shared experience. It was now a private ritual. The bath moved into the home, into the realm of architecture and status. The communal stew tub was gone, replaced by porcelain and copper, by scented soaps and tiled walls. But some things were lost. The camaraderie of the bathhouse, the rituals of herbs and sweat, the old songs hummed in steam, all were swept away in favor of sterility, of privacy, silence. And so you must wonder, what did we lose when we abandoned the stew tub? What was left behind in the rise of cleanliness, of science, of control? Because even though the medieval bathhouse was flawed, dangerous, dirty, decadent, it was also deeply human, a place where people gathered not just to wash, but to connect, to laugh, to share stories, to sit beside strangers and remember that their lives, too, were made of bone and breath and ache. The bathhouse was not just about water, it was about belonging, and perhaps in our own sterile bathrooms, behind locked doors and polished tiles, we have forgotten that. Let's begin in a quiet, frost-lined village in the year 1449. There's a pale sky overhead. It's a kind that suggests snow, but offers none. The river nearby runs sluggish, coated at its edges with a brittle crust of ice. Smoke curls from a few chimneys. Children gather kindling. Dogs sleep in doorways. And inside the local church, a murmur rises not of prayer, but of panic. A woman has been accused. Her name is Elise. She is about 40 years old, owns a black goat, and sometimes walks barefoot in the fields. These are, in truth, her only crimes. But her neighbor's daughter has taken ill, feverish, and thrashing. The mother is certain that something unnatural is at play. Lise, she insists, has cursed the child, and it's only a matter of time before others are harmed. Accusation turns quickly into procedure. A crowd forms. The village priest consults old texts. The scribe writes a name on a parchment sheet with a heavy black quill. Kent. Quietly, someone brings up the bath. Not a cleansing bath, not a comforting soak. No, this bath has another purpose. It is known by many names. The ordeal by water, the trial by boiling. The witch is washed out. To understand what happens next, we must step back, not just into the village, but into the strange logic of medieval justice, where water itself could testify, could judge, could reveal guilt or innocence by temperature, by buoyancy, or by how deeply your skin blistered. In medieval Europe, bathing had long been entangled with symbolism. Cleanliness and purity, both spiritual and physical, were seen as signs of godliness. To be washed, especially with care, was to align oneself with holiness. But that same symbolism could be twisted. In times of fear, especially during outbreaks of which hunts, the rituals of bathing were turned inside out. The ordeal by hot water was one such ritual. It was brutally simple. A large cauldron or iron pot was filled with water and brought to a boil. A stone or ring was dropped into the bottom. The accused, often a woman, though not always, was made to plunge her bare hand into the scalding water and retrieve the item. Then the real waiting began. The hand would be bandaged. 3 days would pass. If the wound festered, if it became infected or failed to heal cleanly, the person was deemed guilty. If it healed well or appeared to, it was taken as proof of innocence. In reality, infection was common. Medicine was rudimentary, and many were condemned. But this wasn't the only watery ordeal used during witch trials. More infamous, perhaps, was the ordeal by cold water, often misunderstood today. This was not about boiling, but about floating. The accused was tied wrists to ankles and lowered into a river or lake. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, she was guilty. This practice had roots in the belief that water, as a pure element, would reject the impure. A witch, it was believed, would float because the water refused to accept her. The tragedy, of course, was that both outcomes were fatal. If the woman sank, she might drown. If she floated, she'd be pulled out only to be hanged or burned. In either case, The water acted as executioner and witness, and yet, people conducting these rituals saw them not as acts of cruelty, but as a means of discovering truth. They did not have forensic science. They had no blood tests. Nay, had symbols, rituals, the language of trial and purification through elements fire, water, air. It's important to remember that medieval witch hunts were not just about religion. They were about control. They emerged during moments of societal pressure, crop failures, outbreaks of plague, economic instability. When people became frightened, they looked for someone to blame. And the idea that one woman, especially one who lived alone or owned herbs, or seemed to clean or to strange might be secretly destroying the world around her, became terrifyingly compelling. Bathing itself became suspicious. If a woman bathed too often, kept herself to clean it, was seen as vanity, even sorcery. Who had the time or means to wash so frequently, unless she was consorting with unnatural forces? If she used scented herbs, people whispered she kept her hair braided and clean in a time when lice were common. They wondered. Paradoxically, dirt could be a form of protection. Some women, fully aware of how cleanliness could be perceived, began to deliberately avoid washing. They embraced filth, hoping to appear humble, pious, and properly burdened by the hardships of life. The logic was cruel and circular. To clean, you were probably in league with demons. Too dirty, you were suspicious by neglect. Too ordinary, hiding something. There was no safe middle back in Elisa's village. The trial is set. The bath is prepared in an iron cauldron carried from the smith's yard, filled with water from the river, then placed above a fire. The flames lick the sides. The water begins to bubble. She is made to step forward. The people gather in silence. There are no cries, no cheers, just watching as her arm reaches in. The heat wraps around her like fire. She holds it, as instructed, for the count of 3. She pulls the ring from the bottom. It is smooth, brass, unremarkable. Her skin peels in layers. Bandages are wrapped, prayers muttered, and then they wait. 3 days. During this time, Elise is locked in a stone hut, fed sparingly. Watched by the priest's apprentice, her family is forbidden to visit. Guard sits outside, sharpening a knife not for her, but for the next goat. On the 3rd day, the priest removes the bandages. The wound is red, slightly puffy, but not yet green, not yet oozing. He pauses. The scribe waits, quill trembling. The villagers look on. Then he shakes his head. Guilty, he says. It's a sentence, it's not a discovery. And in that moment, the bath has done its work, not to cleanse, not to heal, but to accuse, to offer the illusion of divine judgment in the absence of evidence. It was not the fire, nor the wound that condemned her. It was the fear, the ritual, the pressure to find fault in someone, anyone who could be touched, hurt, or burned. Baths in medieval witch trials were not for comfort. They were for punishment, for purification in its most violent form. We were built on the belief that water could reveal what words could not. But what does it mean when water, once the element of healing, becomes a tool of harm? When the very act of bathing, of touching the sacred elements, becomes cause for suspicion? What does it say about a world so frightened of the unseen that it turned to scalding water, icy rivers, and bandaged arms as arbiters of truth? And more curiously still, how did this change? When did water, again, become safe? That's the question we'll explore next, because the story doesn't end with boiling pots and cursed rings. It continues in cities where medical science begins to peek through the veil. In convents where nuns rediscover old texts on herbal baths. And in courtrooms where whispers of sorcery start to sound less like fact, and more like superstition. But even as progress comes, the memory of those baths lingers, of how water was made to speak and how many were drowned in its silence. In the early years of the 16th century, the power of the church over European life was absolute. The rise of the Inquisition, a force that governed not only the intellectual and religious, but also the social and physical, heralded a new phase of scrutiny for the body. Bathing, once a simple, functional act, now became a litmus test for purity, line of defense between sin and salvation, between life and death. In the small, dimly lit corners of Europe's villages, bathhouses that had once been places of healing and community now became the scene of judgment. When a person was accused of witchcraft, they didn't just face a trial of words, they faced a trial of the body. Whether through water, fire, or the bizarre ritual of the swimming test, the physical body became both the battlefield and the accused. And for many women, those familiar rituals, be it a simple dip in a communal bath or the infamous ordeal by boiling, became their undoing. The early 1500s were a time of intensifying witch hunts. As the Reformation spread across Europe, the Catholic Church and the Protestant factions began to fear the growth of heretical sects and the power of women outside patriarchal control. It was a period where the witchcraft craze reached its fever. Pitch trials occurred at an unprecedented scale. And behind every accusation, there was often a twisted connection to the body's cleanliness or lack thereof. Witchcraft was not seen as a mere crime against the church. It was a crime against nature, a crime against the very order of the world. The accused were often isolated women, midwives, herbalists, or healers figures who had power over the body. And in a society that feared the unknown, the body itself became a weapon. The body of the accused would be subjected to all manner of tests of purity, tests of sickness, tests of guilt. The ordeal by boiling, which was most common in places like Germany and France, was a particularly cruel and grotesque version of these body trials. It wasn't just about the immediate pain of the scalding water. It was a public spectacle, test, designed to humiliate and shame the accused while simultaneously offering the community a sense of justice. The water, now feared for its ability to expose evil, would be scalding hot, bubbling with the weight of superstition. The accused would be made to stick their hands into the pot of boiling liquid, often picking up a heavy object from the bottom, like a stone or a ring. It was believed that if the skin remained intact and the wound healed properly, the person was pure and thus innocent. If the hand was burned, the sin was obvious and the witch was deemed guilty. If the skin peeled away and the person began to suffer from a severe infection, it was evidence that they were cursed by the devil. The community would consider their condemnation just. There was no room for interpretation, no margin for error. This was an ordeal that played upon the community's deepest fears. It transformed the body from an instrument of survival to a signal of divine wrath. But the ordeal didn't always end in death. A small but significant part of these trials was the role of community influence. People didn't just suffer in isolation. They were watched, judged, and sometimes even cheered on during these tests. The trial by water or boiling often became an exhibition where the community came together to publicly determine the truth. It was as if society was placed in the position of the judge and executioner, and the witch's pain became their common spectacle. This phenomenon can be traced back to older traditions of ritualized justice in medieval Europe, especially before the rise of a formal legal system. Communities often relied on trial by ordeal as a means of testing guilt. These tests were believed to reveal the truth because they placed the accused in the hands of divine will, God. As with the boiling ordeal, the boundary between divine and human judgment was increasingly blurred. What started as a religious practice began to transform into a political tool. By the time the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487, bathing had become part of the broader witch hunt discourse. written by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The book justified the existence of witches and prescribed ways of detecting, prosecuting, and punishing them. It provided a dangerous foundation for many of the rituals associated with witch trials, including the role of physical purification in determining guilt. The Malleus Maleficarum promoted the idea that witches were physically and morally impure, and their impurity could be detected through rituals, including bathing. In the 16th century, bathing with the accused or placing them in boiling water was seen as a purging act, as if immersing a suspected witch in hot water could burn away her demonic associations. The trial resulted in her being found clean. It meant the spirit of impurity had been washed away. The wounds festered. She was doomed to death. The focus on bathing, cleanliness, and purification echoed deeply in the cultural psyche of the time. Rituals of purification were, after all, not new to medieval societies. They were woven into daily life through practices like fasting, confession, and penance. But in the case of witch trials, they became warped. Bathing, once considered a health practice, now became a spiritual test. Interestingly, the trials also demonstrated a gripping paradox about hygiene. On one hand, the medieval world believed that a clean body could act as a vessel for the soul. On the other hand, cleanliness and purification were seen as impossible goals for those accused of witchcraft. The connection between bodily purity and moral worth collapsed during the witch craze when cleanliness and the absence of blemishes were not enough to save someone. As witch trials became more institutionalized, bathing rituals were given more elaborate rules and came to represent more than just the cleansing of the body. They were instruments of societal control and discrimination. Those accused of witchcraft were often marginalized individuals, older women, the poor, or those with healing knowledge that clashed with the established medical understanding. Their very existence challenged traditional social structures, and the bath became a public reflection of that challenge. Even the symbolism of water became problematic. Once a symbol of purity and life, it morphed into an agent of judgment and exclusion. Innocence was no longer associated with a pure body, but with a series of rituals that tested whether the body could withstand the will of God. As the 16th century unfolded, these trials began to involve more elaborate accusations. Witchcraft was increasingly tied to uncontrolled passions, especially those involving women. The body was once again scrutinized, and bathing, or the inability to purify oneself properly, became a judgment of character. But it also became a tool to control and break down anyone who deviated from the accepted norms. It wasn't just the body that was judged in these trials. It was the soulette, was the community's perception of cleanliness, innocence, and purity. And so, as the witch hunts eventually faded into the 17th and 18th centuries, the use of bathing as a measure of guilt remained a testament to medieval fears that will continue to shape the way society viewed not only women but also outliers. In general, the rituals of the body stripped, burned, bathed, and tested would leave long-lasting scars on the collective memory of medieval Europe. But the memory of those tortured bodies and the confusing role of cleanliness in determining life or death serves as a reminder. The body has always been more than just flesh. The rituals of bathing might have been meant to heal, to purify, and to refresh, but in the shadow of accusation, they became something more chilling, a litmus test of morality, a weaponized ritual used to control, to judge, and to silence. And now, in the quiet of the present, we wonder, what would it have been like to witness that trial? To watch someone whose life and body were placed at the mercy of a single, terrifying ritual, one that could leave them scarred or dead, depending on the whims of belief. Would you survive that test, or would you, too, be seen as unclean? By the mid-17th century, the furious storm of witch hunting across Europe began to lose strength. Not because people had grown more compassionate, nor because they had realized the cruelty of their actions, but because the systems that once justified these persecutions had begun to buckle under the weight of skepticism, bureaucratic fatigue, and the gradual rise of scientific reasoning. But what lingered, like steam clinging to a bathhouse wall, were the rituals, the memories of scalded hands, the stench of burning oil, the agonized screams from trial by water, and the communal belief that one's soul could be judged by the cleanliness of their flesh. Even as the tools of torture were retired and the witches' prisons emptied, a strange silence followed, not of peace, but of forgetting. Witch trials had never been just about heresy or demonic pacts. They had been about the body, especially the female body, and its perceived susceptibility to sin. And so, even after the last legal burning flickered out in the early 18th century, the belief that one's moral compass could be read through their hygiene habits remained deeply entrenched. Where once communal baths were a place of gathering, they were now often regarded with suspicion. The very idea of immersing oneself in shared water, once a social or therapeutic norm, became associated with excess, indulgence, and even depravity. Public bathhouses were shuttered or neglected. The reformers, religious and political, alike encouraged private cleanliness, not as an act of wellness, but of moral vigilance. A person's bathroom routine, or lack thereof, wasn't just a sign of health. It was a signal of their place in the moral order. The irony, of course, was that many of the same ruling classes that preached cleanliness were often among the least physically clean by modern standards. Perfume masked what water might have washed away. Powder replaced bathing. Lace collars covered rashes. But the important thing was appearing clean, not necessarily being clean. The transformation of bathing from a communal act of health to a private act of self-control was gradual, but deeply symbolic. In Protestant regions like England and Scotland, where the Reformation had taken a strong hold, the church no longer enforced confessions through physical ordeal, but they did encourage a kind of internal policing. One's body was now one's own responsibility, and the daily rituals of washing became entangled with feelings of guilt, temptation, and control. Women, especially, were still seen as the carriers of impurity. The same midwives who had once been accused of sorcery were now often written out of medical practice entirely, replaced by male physicians. These doctors, armed with anatomical knowledge and a growing interest in bodily regulation, continued to shape societal views on the female form. And though they no longer accused women of flying on broomsticks, they still treated them as objects of scrutiny, especially in matters of reproductive health and hygiene. The bath became a paradox, both a place of relief and a site of vulnerability. Many women who had grown up under the threat of witch accusations carried deep ambivalence about bathing. It was necessary, yes, but too much washing, too much attention to one's body. That could be read as vanity, pride sins in their own right. In towns across Central and Northern Europe, water was no longer trusted in the way it once was. Holy water, once used for baptism and cleansing, became symbolic, not literal. It would be sprinkled, not bathed in. The large communal tubs and steaming pools of earlier centuries were replaced with tin basins, private cloths, and cautious dabs. In some places, doctors even warned against full immersion, believing it opened the pores to bad airs or disease. This suspicion of water and the body echoed for centuries. By the time the Enlightenment arrived, bathing had become associated more with science and sanitation than spirituality, but the moral undercurrent remained. The body, especially the female body, still carried the weight of expectations of purity, modesty, restraint. Think for a moment about how the concept of cleanliness shows up in our language even today. A clean record, a clean conscience, a clean woman. These phrases didn't emerge by accident. They are linguistic fossils, remnants of a time when being clean wasn't just about physical dirt, it was about worth, The witch trials, with their boiling cauldrons and scalding baths, may have ended in courtrooms, but they didn't end in culture. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as urbanization spread and new public health crises emerged, cholera, typhus, smallpox, the medical establishment began to recognize the value of cleanliness in preventing disease. Bathing was reintroduced to the public, but with new language. It was no longer about purity of the soul, but protection of the body. Hospitals were built with bath wards. Prisons began to enforce regular washing. Schools taught hygiene as part of citizenship. And yet, this return to water came with new rules about respectability. Poor communities were often depicted as filthy, not just in their homes, but in their morals. Immigrant women were described as unhygienic, not just in terms of cleanliness, but in virtue. In pamphlets and medical guides, their dirty habits were tied to dangerous sexuality, uncontrolled fertility, and social decay. Cleanliness had become classed, gendered, and policed. Some towns even created public bathhouses under the label of moral improvement, offering cheap access to a hot bath, but also instruction on proper domestic behavior. Bathing, once again, became a stage upon which power played out. It's no coincidence that laundries, bathhouses, and public fountains were so often gendered spaces. Women, burdened with the care of others and the need to prove their decency, spent hours each week boiling linens, washing bodies, scrubbing surfaces, not just to remove dirt, but to perform virtue. And so we circle back to those medieval women placed in boiling water, not for dirt, but for doubt. Not for healing, but for punishment. Their hands, blistered and raw, were seen not as medical tragedies, but as moral confirmations. In their pain, others found clarity. In their suffering, others found order. The witch trial ordeal was not about discovering truth. It was about confirming suspicion. It was a theater where belief and fear directed the script long before the curtain rose. And those centuries have passed, the echoes of those performances remain. Today, we rarely face trials by boiling water, but we still live in a world where cleanliness is used as shorthand for morality, where people are judged by their appearances, where the body still bears the weight of old beliefs. The bath may now be scented with oils and salts. The scalding pot may be replaced by porcelain tubs, but if you listen closely, in the hiss of steam and the splash of water, you can still hear the faint whisper of old trials, a whisper that asks, "Are you clean enough? Are you pure? Are you safe? Oh, perhaps more hauntingly, would you survive the bath? The bath?" You awaken before the sun rises, not from a dream, but from a bell, a cold iron clang that echoes across the stone halls like a judgment. It's winter in the 12th century Benedictine monastery in northern France, and the world outside your cell is as black and still as the tomb. You have not spoken aloud in days. Silence is not a punishment. Here it is the rule. And soon you will do what every brother must do this morning. Face the bitter ritual of the cold bath, not because your body is dirty, but because your soul has died. This is not punishment for sin. This is the discipline to prevent it. Because here, in the cloistered world of the monastery, the body is suspect. Its warmth, its urges, its desire to rest, to feel. All of it is the enemy of salvation. And so, you wash it, not gently, not indulgently, but with freezing water, drawn before dawn, with no fire to warm it. The bath is not meant to comfort. It is meant to subdue. Welcome to the strange, quiet world of monastic bathing in the Middle Ages. The popular image of the medieval period often paints monks as either aloof scholars or gluttonous wine sippers in quiet abbeys. But that is only part of the truth. In many monasteries, especially during the High and Late Middle Ages, life was defined by one word: austerity. Everything in a monk's daily rhythm was designed to subdue the flesh. Sleep was minimal. Food was plain, work was constant, and when it came to personal hygiene, the idea of cleanliness was not about appearance, it was about discipline. Bathing, when allowed, was carefully regulated. In early Benedictine rules, derived from the 6th century rule of Saint Benedict, baths were not forbidden, but they were approached with suspicion. Comfort was dangerous. Heat was indulgent. Monks were to bathe only when necessary, typically no more than 5 times per year unless illness demanded more, and even then it was done under the strict guidance of an abbot. But there were exceptions. In colder regions of Europe, or among stricter orders like the Cistercians, monks would sometimes take cold baths regularly, not to clean the skin, but to cool the passions. A body that is warm is a body that may feel temptation. A body that is cold, stiff, and humbled by the sting of freezing water is less likely to wander, less likely to fall into lustful dreams, less likely to disobey. This was especially true for monks in their formative years, novices. The transition from the secular world to cloistered life was not immediate. Young men and occasionally women in convents often entered monasteries as teenagers, full of questions, energy, and most dangerous of all, desire. The cold bath was their instructor, a physical lesson in what this new life would demand of them. Many of these bathings were not full immersions. In fact, monasteries often lacked large tubs or bathhouses. Instead, monks would kneel or stand as another poured water over them from a jug or ladle. Sometimes this would be done outdoors. In winter, it meant ice had to be cracked. In summer, it meant rising even earlier to avoid the sun's warmth. Towels were coarse. Soap was rare. There were no oils, no perfumes, no indulgences. The idea was to keep the soul alert by keeping the flesh humbled, and for those monasteries that did, contained bathing rooms, typically called balnearias, built of stone, often with rudimentary drainage. These rooms were stark, or reused Roman structures, echoing with memories of communal Roman bathing culture, now repurposed for silence and shivering. Gone were the hours-long lounging and gossiping of Roman baths. Here, the bath was taken in under 10 minutes, often in total silence. But there was a contradiction. Cleanliness was still valued, especially for those monks who worked in the infirmary, tending to the sick. Hygiene mattered. Diseases spread easily in close quarters, and monastic communities were not immune to the plagues and skin infections that afflicted the peasantry. So monks developed something rare in medieval Europe, a system. They implemented rotational bathing schedules, showing that at least certain monks were regularly cleaned, especially before entering sacred spaces. Some monasteries kept logs called customals that listed when and how baths were to be taken. The baths shall be made ready every Saturday, one Cistercian custom states, okay? And the brothers shall wash 2 by 2 in silence. Silence, always silence. Bathing together was both a practicality and a danger. To bathe alone was a logistical challenge, but to bathe in pairs, naked, was a test of discipline. Young novices were often not permitted to bathe with older monks, not out of hierarchy, but out of fear. The body might arouse, even unintentionally. And so baths were supervised, watched, controlled. In many monasteries, the most senior monkophon, the infirmarian, was responsible for ensuring bathing rules were followed, not out of concern for health, but to maintain purity. Water was sacred, yes, but only when it served control. One of the most fascinating examples comes from the Carthusians, a stricter, more eremitic order. Unlike other monastics, Carthusians lived largely in isolation, in small individual cells or huts connected by covered walkways. Their rule was even more demanding than Benedict's. Bathing, in this context, was not just rare, was nearly absent. Some Carthusian monks reportedly bathed only once per year, just before Easter, a symbolic washing. The rest of the year, their ablutions were limited to wiping the face, hands, and perhaps the feet. Why? Because suffering was the path to God, and suffering through filth, comfort, and the rejection of worldly comfort was a form of ascetic prayer. To be dirty was to be holy, so long as the dirt was worn in obedience, not vanity. But this rejection of comfort had its consequences. Lice, scabies, and skin infections were common. Monasteries often created delousing stations where robes and bedclothes were boiled. Ash and vinegar were used to scrub floors. The sick were quarantined, sometimes within the cloister, other times moved to nearby hospices. Monks who refused to bathe even when visibly unwell could be disciplined, not for breaking hygiene laws, but for disobeying the abbot's will, because, in the end, obedience mattered more than health. A monk might die of exposure, but if he died in perfect submission, his soul would be saved. The world outside the cloister watched with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. To the average peasant, a bath was a luxury, rarely taken more than once or twice per year in a wooden barrel or by the river. To the aristocrat, bathing might be symbolic or scented or purely aesthetic, but to the monk, it was a weapon, a cold, calculated act of self-denial. And yet, in these icy rituals, something remarkable happened. Some monks found peace. There are scattered records, hidden in letters, marginalia, and later reflections of monks who, despite the hardship, found a kind of spiritual clarity through these cold rites. In the silence, in the pain, in the steam of water against stone, a bath became a sacrament. Not just a denial of the flesh, but a communion with something deeper. Not all endured it willingly. Many novices left the monastery before completing their training. Some broke under the strain. Others became sick, simply pretended to conform, going through the motions of washing, praying, fasting, while quietly dreaming of warmth, laughter, in a forbidden world outside. But the ritual remained. Cold water, rough cloth, a bowed head, because in the quiet logic of the monastery, suffering was not something to be avoided. It was something to be used. And water, even in its cruelest form, was a tool for shaping the soul. So when we picture medieval baths, we often imagine the steamy, crowded bathhouses of towns, the barbers who doubled as surgeons, the scented oils, the wooden tubs. But that was only one side of the medieval world. The other side, the monastic side, was defined not by pleasure, by endurance, by cold, by control. And it makes one wonder, how many of us today could rise before dawn, strip in silence, and plunge our body into a bucket of water drawn from an icy stream wall, because we believed our soul needed taming? And if we couldn't, what does that say about how far we've drifted from the idea that discipline, discomfort, and devotion can be drawn from something as simple as a bath? As a bath, you stand on flagstone with bare feet, and already you are trembling, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the ritual ahead. You've made a mistake, a sin not of violence or theft, but of thought. Maybe your eyes lingered too long on a novice's face, or your mind wandered during prayer, or perhaps during your brief weekly letter home. Your heart felt longing, something soft, something not permitted here in the outside world. These are moments you might overlook, but in a monastery, they're significant. In this world, even your dreams are scrutinized. And so today, you've been instructed to bath not as a routine, not as hygiene, but as penance. The cold water isn't for the skin, it's for the soul. In the cloistered world of medieval monasticism, bathing was not only a discipline of the body, it could be a sentence, a spiritual sentence handed down by the abbot or prior in response to a minor breach of the rule. And unlike corporal punishment, which was rarely used In more scholarly monasteries, bathing could serve as a more sophisticated kind of suffering. It did not leave bruises, but it lingered longer. The connection between water and penance goes far deeper than just cold. In Christian theology, water is a symbol of rebirth. Baptism is immersion into Christ's death and resurrection. But here, monks would undergo what could be called a reverse baptisma, cold washing, not of grace, but of guilt. This was especially true during Lent, the 40 days of fasting and repentance leading up to Easter. Some monasteries would permit a special cleansing bath as a symbolic way to begin or end the period of self-denial. Others required a cold ablution at the midpoint, especially for those who had been found lacking in their discipline. There are scattered records from monastic chroniclers, obscure monks who scribbled notes in margins or left behind account books that describe how these bathings were arranged. In one 13th century Sturtian monastery in the Vosges Mountains, the custom notes, "Let the brother who has transgressed be instructed to wash before Lauds, with no warmth, no fire lit, and alone, save for the infirmarian who shall observe." The key here was isolation. While monks often bathed in pairs for logistical reasons, a penitential bath was done alone or worse, under watchful supervision. The absence of fire in winter was not just a logistical note, it was a conscious denial of comfort. And the reason for this discomfort wasn't just about enduring suffering. It was about control, both social and spiritual. To understand why a bath could serve as penance, we must look at how monasteries handled sin. Contrary to modern perception, monks were not immune from temptation or error. They were human, after all. And in an institution built on silence, obedience, and humility, confession became an essential practice. But confession in the medieval monastery was not always the private, whispered sacrament we imagine today. In some cases, particularly in stricter order sins, were confessed publicly in chapter meetings. These were daily gatherings where monks read aloud from the rule of Saint Benedict and reflected on their conduct. If a brother had sinned, fallen asleep during prayer, spoken out of turn, eaten secretly between meals, he might rise, step into the center of the circle, and bow deeply to confess. No theatrics, just a few words, then silence. The abbot or prior would then assign penance. Sometimes this meant fasting, or prayer, or being denied part in communal worship. But in certain communities, it also meant being sent to wash cold, alone, and without the comfort of fire or cloth. This act wasn't about physical cleanliness, it was symbolic. The sinner must feel the chill of isolation and the sting of water. Only then could he be welcomed back into the warmth of community. It's a strange thing how water, the source of life, was used here as a tool of emotional and spiritual correction. The monks themselves wrote rarely about these rituals. Their job was not to describe themselves, but to erase themselves. But every so often, a voice slips through in one preserved letter from the 14th century. A monk, known only as Brother Willimus, writes to his sister, "This week I am to wash in silence." Brother Gregor says, "It is for the words I whispered at table, though I do not recall them." The water stung more than the rebuke. Yet, as I stood shivering, I thought of the River Jordan and wondered whether John the Baptist's hands were as cold. He does not complain. He does not resist. But his quiet irony reveals what many monks surely felt, the burden of constantly regulating not just action, but thought. The bath, in this sense, became a mirror. Not one of silver glass, but of icy water. It reflected back the things that were supposed to remain hidden: longing, pride, defiance, or grief. And for some monks, it became a refuge, a way to feel without speaking. There's another layer here, often missed in secular accounts of medieval monastic life: the gendered burden of purity. While much is written about monks, medieval nunneries had their own rituals of penance and washing. For women, the body was viewed as even more suspect. Female monastics were often subject to harsher restrictions around cleanliness, not because they were considered dirtier, but because they were believed to be more easily tempted by bodily comfort. Many convents did not permit warm water at all. Some discouraged full bathing, fearing it might excite the senses. And, just like their male counterparts, nuns used water as a form of penance. Washing was done quickly, quietly, and in shifts, supervised by the prioress or a senior sister. Confession often led to ablution, especially for young novices still struggling with vanity. As one 13th century record phrases it, "What's curious is how rare written complaints are, either because the practice was accepted or because writing them down would have been seen as another sin." And yet, not all bathing was punitive. There were moments, fleeting, seasonal, when washing was allowed as preparation for sacred celebration. Easter, Christmas, and certain feast days prompted ritual cleansing for all members of the monastery. Monks would wash their hands, feet, and sometimes even their entire bodies in preparation for communion or special masses. These were not cold punishments, but sacred preparations, ways of readying the body for the presence of the divine. Some monasteries even maintained a special tub or basin known as the lavatorium, distinct from the dining lavatorium where hands were rinsed. This was reserved for holy washing. On feast days, water might be scented with herbs lavender, sage, or rosemary, not for indulgence, but for symbolism. Still, even these cleansings were brief. No lounging, no towels warmed by the hearth, just function and prayer, because even when washing for joy, the goal was humility. Over the centuries, the practice of penance through bathing faded as monasteries changed and as theological thought shifted during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. The emphasis on extreme asceticism softened. Warm water was no longer seen as a sign. Hygiene began to carry medical importance again, especially after the Black Death by the 16th century. Some abbeys even had rudimentary hot water systems borrowed from Roman designs. And while the ritual of the cold penitential bath never fully vanished, it was increasingly reserved for those seeking stricter personal discipline, often voluntarily. But for the monks of the 12th to 14th centuries, the cold bath was a daily reminder. The soul is not soothed by warmth. It is forged in discomfort. And so we return to the shivering figure in the early dawn, bowed over a basin. You, kneeling in the dark, feel the water trickle over your shoulders. You gasp, but you do not speak. The bucket clinks, the stone beneath. Your knees numbed your legs. A distant bell tolls. You've repented, you've washed, and yet, in the silence that follows, a question lingers: were you really cleansed, or merely chilled into silence? As the sun begins to rise higher in the sky, the cold bath has already become a memory. In the stone cells of the monastery, the ritual is a quiet echo of the past. A practice handed down through centuries, now slowly fading from daily life. The monks who once endured these frigid washings with devotion and humility have passed away or been replaced by new generations. For those who remain, the days of strict austerity are drawing to a close. Change is in the air, though it is not always visible at first. In the early years of the 16th century, monastic life began to shift. The grand Catholic reforms and the rise of Protestantism gradually transformed not only the way people viewed religion, but also how they viewed their bodies. With the Reformation, new theological ideas emerged about the nature of sin and salvation, fundamentally altering how the body was treated within religious practice. Where once monks would rigorously enforce the practices of abstinence, fasting, and physical suffering, believing these acts could cleanse the soul from sin, the changing tides of spirituality started to reshape the role of the body in the pursuit of holiness. As Protestantism spread across Europe, the concept of bodily mortifications, such as cold baths, fasting, and self-flagellation was increasingly questioned. Protestant leaders like Martin Luther and John Calvin criticized practices that they saw as a form of works-based salvation. They emphasized that salvation came through faith alone, not through outward rituals of penance or the mortification of the flesh. Luther, in particular, railed against the indulgences and rituals that had become so ingrained in Catholic doctrine, including those that involved the purification of the body through suffering. This theological shift had profound consequences on monastic practices, especially regarding bathing. For centuries, the idea that purity of the body was inextricably linked to purity of the soul had permeated not only monastic life, but society as a whole. Yet, as Protestant ideas took root, bathing itself was no longer seen as a necessary tool for spiritual purification. Instead, there was a push to focus on inner cleansing and spiritual health rather than physical cleanliness. This led to a slow decline in the harsh ascetic practices of the past. As these changes swept across Europe, many monasteries, particularly those in Protestant regions, began to abandon the rigorous and often painful rituals of cold baths and fasting. The Cistercians, a reformist order known for its strict observance of poverty and simplicity, began to relax some of their more demanding rituals, including the harsh cold baths. In fact, by the 16th century, even some of the most ascetic orders allowed their monks to bathe with warm water, something that would have been unthinkable just a century before. In France, the Trappist branch of the Cistercian order began to soften the rules around bathing. The monks could still immerse themselves in water, but only when necessary, not as a form of punishment. What had once been a deeply spiritual practice of humbling the flesh through discomfort began to be seen as an unnecessary ritualistic burden, a leftover from the darker days of medieval asceticism. The decline of such practices was not sudden. It took decades for cold baths and other extreme forms of purification to be fully abandoned. But with the rise of new medical understandings, hygiene became a priority in many monasteries. Hygiene, however, was no longer linked with penance, but with health. What had once been about punishing the body in the name of the soul was slowly replaced by the more practical idea of keeping the body free from disease and infection. The first signs of modernity crept into these old monastic walls. In 1633, Louis XIII of France issued an edict that allowed monks and nuns to begin using hot water for their baths, especially in larger royal monasteries. At the same time, the use of perfumes, oils, and fragrant waters slowly began to re-enter monastic life. What had once been an exorcism of the flesh now became part of a healthful routine. This change was not just a matter of convenience, but a fundamental shift in how the monks viewed themselves. The cold bath was no longer the preferred method of spiritual purification, and the adoption of warmer waters was a sign that the monks were beginning to think differently about their bodies. By the late 17th century, most monasteries no longer enforced the freezing ablutions as part of their daily routines. Instead, the focus turned toward personal cleanliness and the health of the community. But now, with a growing emphasis on spiritual health instead of body denial. However, the old ritual of the cold bath didn't vanish entirely. It was reinterpreted and preserved as part of the monastic legacy, particularly in isolated, remote monasteries where the monastic tradition remained relatively unaltered. These were the monasteries where asceticism continued as the bedrock of spiritual life. Carthusian monks and certain small Benedictine orders in parts of rural Italy and Spain retained vestiges of this harsh practice, though these were usually reserved for penitential occasions rather than daily routines. The notion that a cold bath could purify not just the body, but also the spirit would never entirely fade. In parts of Europe, this idea persisted in various forms, slowly evolving into self-discipline techniques and spiritual cleansing practices outside of the cloister. Some found the practice of cold water therapy in modern health spas to be rooted in these medieval traditions, while the cold bath rituals began to diminish in formal monasteries. Their influence lingered on in popular culture, particularly in regions where old traditions were kept alive by folk beliefs in rural communities. The belief that water could purify the soul, drive out demons, remained in folk rituals well into the 18th century in rural France, for example. Some peasants would still undergo cold water baptisms as a form of penance for minor transgressions. They would submerge themselves in the village river or stand in a freezing stream to wash away their sins. These rituals, while not directly connected to the strict monastic rules, were vestiges of a time when the purification of the body was still viewed as essential to the purification of the spirit. Even more fascinating, in parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia, monks of the Russian Orthodox Church continued a tradition of cold water immersion into the 19th century as part of their Lenten fasting rituals. In these monasteries, cold baths were often conducted on major feast days as part of the spiritual cleansing process, invoking both the ancient practices of the early church and the more severe, medieval ascetic practices that had defined Eastern monasticism for centuries. These practices, while much more symbolic by this time, were deeply rooted in the early medieval notion that the body's discomfort led to a stronger, purer soul. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, the once powerful connection between cleanliness and morality began to fray. Hygiene, once tied to spiritual control, slowly emerged as a secular matter of health and personal well-being. The understanding of germs and sanitation became more widely accepted, transforming public health policies and replacing the medieval idea of bodily purification with modern ideas of prevention. In this new era, cold bath was reimagined once more not as a punishment for sin, but as a medical treatment for ailments like fever, muscle pain, and fatigue. The rise of spas and thermal baths in the 18th century brought back the idea of hot and cold water as restorative. But this time, it was not about sanctification, it was about rejuvenation. And yet, even now, the memory of those ancient rituals lingers, woven into the fabric of modern society. The practice of cold water immersion has made something of a comeback. In recent years, championed by proponents of biohacking, wellness culture, and even modern athletes, cold baths, ice baths, and the Wim Hof method, which promotes controlled exposure to cold as a way to improve mental clarity and physical endurance, are direct descendants of those old monastic ideas. In some way, we have come full circle, though the language has changed. What was once a purifying and punitive act meant to cleanse the soul of its desires is now seen as a form of physical regeneration. The relationship between body and spirit, between cleanliness and morality, has altered over centuries, but it has never disappeared. So, we are left with a question that echoes through history. From the cold stone cells of monastic Europe to the modern gyms and wellness spas of today, do we cleanse to purify the soul? Or do we purify to strengthen the body? It's early morning in the town of Regensburg, nestled in the Holy Roman Empire, circa the year 1451. Along the cobbled lane, just past the fishmonger's square, the thin steam curls above the tiled roof of the town's most frequented bathhouse. The bathhouse keeper, whose name, if recorded, is likely something humble and steady, like Anna or Friedrich, has already been awake for hours. Their job begins not when the first customer knocks on the wooden door, but when the hearth is stoked and the stone cauldrons begin their long process of heating water. This is no sacred monastery. This is the world of public bathing, half hygiene, half social ritual, and fully entrenched in the oddly mundane rhythm of medieval urban life. By the 15th century, bathhouses were a common feature in most towns across Central Europe. They weren't simply places to clean oneself. They were gathering points for merchants, bakers, midwives, tailors, and sometimes even monks who came in secret. These public spaces served as the quiet theaters of everyday life where townspeople washed off the day's grime, conducted private business, exchanged rumors, or simply escaped the cold. But someone had to maintain all of this. The heat, the towels, the scents of rosemary and pine, the order, the silence when needed. That person, more often than not, was a bathhouse attendant. Not a noble position, but not a forgotten one either. The job was deceptively complex. In the medieval bathhouse, there was no turning a faucet and walking away. The water had to be fetched from wells or nearby rivers and carried in wooden buckets slosh after slosh 2 large stone basins. Fires had to be fed constantly, measured with care, lest the heat become dangerous. Rooms were lined with wood or tile, and these needed scrubbing with ash or sand daily to prevent mold from spreading. It was not uncommon for attendants to begin their work before dawn and finish well after the final guests had left in the evening, and they were watched. Not by authorities, but by society's eyes, those regular patrons who noticed everything: a forgotten rag, a lukewarm tub, a missing herb. These details mattered in a place that lived or died on word of mouth. People didn't just come to bathe, they came to expect a particular kind of experience, something comforting, familiar. So the bathhouse attendant learned to anticipate when the widow Clara arrived on Wednesdays. Her favorite basin was already filled. She liked her water slightly cooler, with mint leaves. The 2 traveling merchants from Mainz. They preferred the hottest room, where steam dripped from the ceiling and made conversation difficult, which suited them just fine. Attendants kept mental logs of each patron's habits: who tipped, who lingered, who brought in children, who argued about price. These things were never written down, of course, but they formed an invisible record in the mind of the worker. There were different types of bathhouses across Europe, each with its own rhythm. In southern Germany, bathhouses leaned heavily into a Roman-inspired model hot water immersion, steam rooms, communal towels. In France, the tradition had evolved in part from monastic and rural examples, often emphasizing fragranced oils and herbal rinses. In England, bathhouses were more rustical stews and often doubled as alehouses or, controversially, as informal brothels. This made the role of the attendant as much a keeper of morality as a stoker of fires. In cities like London, ordinances were passed repeatedly trying to regulate bathhouse behavior, yet people kept returning for warmth and comfort, even when the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, and again in later decades. The desire for communal bathing did not fully disappear, though it waned in waves. Bathhouses were briefly shuttered, then reopened with new rituals. Patrons might be required to wash their hands in lye before entering, or have their hair doused in vinegar. Attendants enforced these rules. They weren't doctors, but they understood what made people feel safe, even when no one really was. The bathhouse itself was divided into sections. There was the undressing room, often lined with benches and pegs, where visitors disrobed and deposited their garments into the attendant's care. Theft was always a concern, especially in busy towns, so attendants often kept watch over clothing like guards over treasure. A missing shoe or misplaced belt could ruin a reputation. From there, patrons moved into the lukewarm chambers, where the air was thick with humidity. These rooms prepared the body for the hotter basins, easing tension and opening pores. Attendants walked quietly through these spaces, adjusting steam vents, offering cloths, and refilling buckets. Finally, there were the hot baths, deep, stone-lined tubs, where people soaked in near silence. These rooms were darker, often lit only by small oil lamps or the orange flicker of the stove. Here, the sound of water echoed softly, interrupted by the occasional groan of relaxation or whispered conversation. In some bathhouses, there were even cooling rooms for those who wished to slowly transition back into the outer world. These were rare, those found mostly in cities, wealthy enough to afford extra rooms and extra labor for the attendant. The job came with more than just physical labor. There was an art to maintaining the delicate balance between privacy and service. Patrons expected attentiveness, but not intrusion. They wanted their needs met before asking, yet without the feeling of being observed. Many attendants learned to tread with slippered feet, to cough quietly when approaching a tub, and to fold towels in precise, silent motions. Some bathhouses were gendered, alternating days for men and women. Others had screens or curtained areas for modesty, and the attendants, especially female ones, had to navigate this landscape with care. A misstep could result in scorn or dismissal. The line between respectable work and questionable behavior was razor thin, especially for women. In towns where the church held power, bathhouse workers were sometimes viewed with suspicion, as they operated outside the domain of strictly religious life. Yet the same priests and monks might visit quietly, especially during the colder months. It was a strange kind of sacred, profaned neutrality. Neither wholly clean nor wholly scandalous. A gray zone that allowed the bathhouse to exist in spite of, and perhaps because of, its ambiguity. Then there was the matter of soap. Soap in the medieval world was not the fragrant, foamy luxury we know today. It was a rougher, grittier affair, made from animal fat, wood ash, and later, lye. In some regions, particularly in southern Europe, olive oil-based soaps became popular, imported from places like Castile or Venice. But for most bathhouse attendants, soap was a local affair made in small batches with varying results. Some smelled of herbs. Others reeked faintly of the smoke they were boiled over. Attendants were often responsible for preparing it themselves, storing chunks in cloth, and shaving it into bowls for daily use. Customers had preferences. Some wanted more abrasive soap to scrape away filth. Others preferred mild, oily mixtures that left the skin slick. There were even occasional disputes, patrons accusing each other of stealing the good soap or asking for more than their share. In the corner of the bathhouse sat a small table. Upon it, a register of sorts, not of names, but of days and events. The bathhouse might mark feast days, market days, or visits from nobility. These events required extra labor, and the attendants often worked late into the evening, adjusting the water temperature, adding flower petals to the tubs, or lighting extra lamps to give the place a glow of warmth. And then, the end of each day, came the final task, draining and cleaning. Every basin had to be emptied, floors scrubbed, soap bowls washed, benches dried. If even one visitor found hair in the bath or a damp towel folded for reuse, it could tarnish the house's reputation. Word traveled fast. Cleanliness wasn't just a courtesy, it was currency, and so the day ended much like it began. In the warm fog of the bathhouse, with the air thick with moisture and the soft sighs of those grateful to be clean, the attendant, often unseen, watched over it all. The flicker of candlelight reflected in the puddles on the floor, the scent of rosemary lingering in the wood grain, the silence after the last patron had gone. One last log thrown on the fire, one last bowl of water tipped outside. A quiet end to a long, unheralded day. You are used to the hum of conversation that lingers in the air. It's been hours since the bathhouse opened, and already you've seen your fair share of customers: peasants, merchants, monks, occasional noble, each one with their own quirks, requests, and needs. You've observed them carefully, as you always do. People rarely notice the attendant, but they reveal themselves in ways they don't even realize. The bathhouse is a microcosm of the town itself, full of subtle power plays and unspoken rules. As you walk between the heated rooms, the warm steam clings to your skin. The wooden beams above your head creak with the weight of centuries of gossip, of secrets shared and overheard. It's almost as if the wood, the water, and the air are all complicit in the subtle drama that unfolds in the bathhouse. Here, everyone is equivalent till they get into the water. Then, the dynamics change. The bathhouse, like any communal space in the medieval world, operated by an unwritten code of conduct, one that was shaped by gender, social status, and rumor. Those who frequented the bathhouse were not just there for cleanliness. They were there for connection, for socializing, for unburdening themselves from the rigid roles of everyday life. The space was an extension of the town square. Allegiances were formed, and information flowed as freely as the water in the tubs. The unspoken power of the bathhouse attendant to assume that the bathhouse attendant's role was purely functional, that your job was just to keep the water warm, the towels clean, and the patrons happy. But that would be an oversimplification. As the attendant, you occupy a peculiar position of power in the bathhouse. It's not because you control the water, but because you control access to it. You know who is likely to take the largest baths and who will only spend a few minutes. You understand which patrons want solitude and which want companionship. You know which nobility arrive with their guards and which merchants come for privacy, seeking refuge from their business dealings. But perhaps most important of all, you hold the power to either reveal or conceal. Gossip flows freely in the bathhouse, and while many of the conversations are about nothing, others are about everything. The merchant's secret affair with a noblewoman, the rumors of the town's leader being involved in shady dealings, the whispers about the young widow's pregnancy whose husband's body was never found. You're careful, of course, you don't speak of these things outside of these walls. But the power you hold is in your silence, in your ability to act as a vessel for other people's stories. While maintaining a neutral facade, you've heard the rumbles from the nobility, the soft laughter of the young lovers, and the heartfelt confessions of the troubled. You've seen the way their eyes dart around the room, for they speak, always aware of who might overhear. The bathroom is a space where people let down their guard, too, but only so far. It's a space where secrets are shared, but not without risk. And as an attendant, you've learned the nuances of these exchanges. You've become part of the fabric of town life, subtly reinforcing the boundaries of class, gender, and privacy. Class distinctions in the bathhouse. The bathhouse was, in many ways, a democratic space. People of all classes could enter, and for a brief moment, they could be equal. The bathing process itself was the same for everyone. Undress, submerge, rinse, and repeat. But when you step back, the inequality becomes apparent. As much as the bathhouse offered temporary equality, so it's also a place of social stratification. The wealthier patrons, particularly the nobles, received more than just a bath. They expected privacy, space, and luxury. For them, the bath was more than just a cleaning ritual. It was an opportunity to display their status, to reinforce their superiority without saying a word. They would book the best rooms away from the masses. The attendants, though humble, were expected to be courteous, silent, and deferential, always addressing the nobles with the appropriate level of respect. For the peasants and townsfolk, bathing was a practical necessity, something to be done quickly, without ceremony. The attendants might throw in a little extra water, add a scented herb, or provide a fresh towel. But the idea was efficiency. Theirs was a functional relationship with the bathhouse, with no room for indulgence. But you see it in the way they hold themselves. The peasants who arrive in groups are sometimes hesitant at first, awkward, not sure if they belong. But the nobility, when they enter, walk with a quiet assurance, knowing they are above reproach. They never speak of their business in public, and yet they do not have to. Their presence is enough. One particular nobleman always arrives with a small entourage. He never bathes with anyone else. When he enters the room, you immediately adjust the temperature of the water, light more lamps, and bring in extra towels. He expects the space to be ready for him not just physically, but socially. There's a ritual in how he disrobes, how he steps into the water, almost as if he were performing an elaborate ceremony. One that demands respect. By contrast, the merchants often arrive in pairs or small groups, but they are often caught up in conversations, discussing deals, negotiations, and their thoughts on the town's latest gossip. They are businessmen, always working. Even here, in the bathhouse, they want connection, but only to a point. They respect the hierarchy of wealth, but don't shy away from questioning the nobility when it suits them. Class is invisible, yet omnipresent. Those who have adjusted their environment to their status. Those who don't have are left to make do. Gender dynamics in the bathhouse. While the bathhouse might have been gender neutral in theory, there was no denying that the roles played by men and women in the bathhouse were different. A woman's role in the bathhouse was subject to the expectations of modesty and propriety. A man, by contrast, was largely free to engage as he wished, whether that meant staying silent in a corner or engaging in conversations with other men. Women, especially those of lower status, often came to the bathhouse together as part of a social gathering. The bath was an opportunity for gossip, bonding, and refreshing from the rigors of household chores. However, women of higher status, especially nobility, were more likely to have private rooms, either for themselves or shared only with trusted confidants. Their time in the bath was still considered sacred, but there was often the desire for seclusion, a shield from the eyes of men. The bathhouse attendant's role when it came to women was delicate. Female patrons expected a high level of discretion. K would allow an attendant to help with changing towels or managing temperature, but there were limits. Men could wander the bathhouse freely. Women, however, were not afforded the same freedom. What was considered modesty for men was often embarrassment for women. The women's bath was often kept separate, sometimes in another wing of the building. Women might have their own attendants, or, in some towns, female attendants would be employed to manage the more private, feminine spaces. But it wasn't always about modesty. It was often about control. In a society where women's social mobility was highly restricted, the bathhouse gave them a rare moment of freedom. But even this was tightly policed by the unspoken gender roles that ruled all aspects of medieval life. Women could talk freely in the bathhouse, yes, but they still had to remain within the social boundaries set for them. The subtle art of eavesdropping as the bathhouse attendant. You have learned the art of eavesdropping, not out of malice, but out of necessity. You've learned to hear conversations that never come to you directly, like the hushed tones of merchants whispering in the corner, or the laughter of young lovers who think they are alone, but aren't. You've learned the way people's voices shift when they are lying, when they are revealing too much, or when they are simply trying to fill the silence. Sometimes, pick up things that you know are important, a town secret, a family scandal, or a gossiping accusation. You remember these things, and you remember who says them, but you never speak of it. And so, as the bathhouse fills and empties, you remain a quiet observer, listening to the world of your town through the steam. You are neither an insider nor an outsider. You are an invisible presence, a silent witness to the human drama that plays out in the warmth of the bath. You will tend to the needs of your patrons, direct their gossip, manage their discomforts, but in the end, it is not the bath that makes them clean. It is the subtle forces of power, gender, and status that define this space, and the unspoken rules of the bathhouse that dictate how far those cleaning rituals can go. The room is unusually quiet now, not the pleasant quiet of late evening when the last bathers finish rinsing and slip away into the cool streets. This is a different kind of quiet. It's hollow, heavy, the kind that feels like the air itself has turned inward. You're sweeping soot from the corners of the steam room, soot that shouldn't be there, soot that wasn't here yesterday. The smoke has begun creeping down from the upper flue again, staining the walls with dark streaks. You pause with your broom. Steam no longer smells sweet, no longer carries the scent of rosemary or lavender. Instead, it stinks of rot, age, of something ending. There was a time, just a few decades ago, when your bathhouse had a waiting list. People would walk from the far end of town just to soak in your stone tubs. New apprentices would queue up to help scrub backs, carry buckets, refill the wood stores. There was laughter once, music, even. You can still remember the tink of lute strings echoing against tile when a local musician played in the corner for tips. That was before people became afraid of each other. Before the whisper of plague turned warm water into something dangerous. The turning tide, when water became fury, didn't happen all at once. The decline was slow, like mold creeping along a beam invisible, until it was too late to stop. At first, there were rumors. Someone claimed that disease could linger in water. Another swore they had fallen ill the day after visiting a different bathhouse. You tried to dismiss it as superstitions, another cycle of nonsense from people who forgot how easily fear spreads, but the stories stuck. As each season passed, fewer customers came. Even the loyal ones, the widowed blacksmith, the nobleman with the aching joints, the baker's wife who loved to gossip, began to visit less. They made excuses. Too busy, too cold, better not risk it. Then one day, someone died. A young merchant, freshly returned from a trade route, collapsed 2 days after bathing. His family said nothing, but the town began to whisper. His name became a caution, spoken softly, like a warning. The council began circulating new guidelines. Shared tubs were discouraged. Communal towels were banned. Attendants, like you, were ordered to wear gloves, to disinfect with vinegar after every session. But it wasn't enough. People had started to view warmth the very essence of your craft, something threatening. The heat, the closeness, the gathering of strangers in one room. It all became suspect, and just like that, the bathhouse show world began to vanish. The rise of privy baths and solitude, dude, started noticing changes in how people approached the idea of cleanliness. Nobles, for instance, began commissioning private baths in their homes. Small wooden tubs lined with linen, filled with water from boiled kettles. Servants would lug buckets upstairs, light fires beside the tub, guard the door to keep others out. Even commoners began purchasing their own basins, simple pottery tubs, or copper kettles in which to wash themselves alone, quietly, without risk. The communal rhythm that had once defined cleanliness, crubbing one another's backs, sharing a joke in the steam room, gathering around a brazier to warm your hands, was replaced by isolation. Cleanliness became solitary, no longer a shared experience, but a personal responsibility. And with that came something unexpected. Shame. You saw it creep in like smoke under the door. People stopped speaking openly about bathing. It became taboo to mention whose house had a tub, or who still frequented the dwindling public baths. Children who once splashed together were now separated. Their parents, afraid of invisible dangers, clinging to the walls. And so, little by little, the heart of the bathhouse, the sense of community, of openness, began to die. The final customers and the echoes, they leave now. You open the bathhouse for fewer hours. Some days, no one comes at all, but a few still return. The old ones, mostly those who remember how it used to be. A cobbler with bent hands, the seamstress with a hacking cough who insists the hot water is the only thing that eases her pain. An ex-soldier who says the bathhouse is the only place he dreams in silence. You serve them all with the same quiet care, and you wonder, sometimes, why they come. Is it for the water, or for the memory of what the bathhouse represented a final, tethered to a time when people were closer to each other? One man, in particular, visits every Wednesday. He brings his own soap, his own towel. He doesn't speak, just nods. You prepare his bath in silence. He bathes quickly, leaves no tip. But he always pauses at the doorway and places one hand flat on the wooden frame. A brief touch, as if he's saying goodbye, as if he knows, like you do, that this place won't be here forever. You haven't had an apprentice in months. No one wants to learn the trade. Why learn how to scrub stone in 10 steam when the world wants pipes and powders and bottled water? The firewood deliveries come later now, more irregular. The town council has reallocated funds to roof leaks. You wonder if anyone will take your place when you're gone. The legacy of water and heat and yet. As you sweep, you reflect on what this place once meant. It was never just about being clean. It was about ritual, about entering a room full of strangers and leaving with something lighter in your chest. It was about healing, not only of the skin, but of the soul. The bathhouse was where people let themselves be seen, not just physically, but humanly here. A nobleman and a merchant once shared a laugh. A peasant girl sang a song that made a knight weep. A widow confessed to a priest that she no longer believed in God. A child asked a stranger if the water would carry dreams. None of those moments made it into any chronicle. No monk wrote them down. But you remember. You remember. And perhaps, in some way, that's what matters most. Maybe one day someone will uncover the ruins of this place and wonder what it was for. Maybe they'll find a scrap of tile, a rusted pipe, a soot-blackened wall. Maybe they'll guess wrong, but you hope they guess right, that they imagine steam curling in golden beams of afternoon light, that they hear the ghost of laughter echoing between stone walls, that they feel warmth not just of fire, but of companionship, and that, even if only for a moment, they see this not as a relic, but as a sanctuary. As you douse the last fire, for the night, you linger in the doorway. The floor is clean. The buckets are stacked. The air is cooling, quieting. You inhale the fading scent of herbs and ash and wonder, did we lose something vital when we stopped bathing together? Did we simply forget that water, like memory, only holds its warmth for so long, so long? There was no scent of soap in this village, no steaming windows, no chimneys coughing up the smoke of freshly fired bathhouses. Instead, the air was thick with the familiar perfume of livestock, wood smoke, and earth. In this place, so far from royal courts and bustling towns that even tax collectors visited only every few years, people bathed once, not once a week, not once a month, but once a year. And you are one of them. You wake before the sun crests over the horizon, and even then, you can feel it in your bones before the birds begin to sing. Today is Bath Day, the one day in the calendar that the entire village has marked in its memory, not written, not carved into wood, but simply understood. Bath Day comes after the harvest has been stored, after the first frost nips at the corners of your boots, but before the snow hardens the earth entirely. It is, of course, not for luxury, nor even entirely for hygiene. Bath Day is for preparing the body to survive the long winter ahead. A ritual barely removed from necessity. In a world without plumbing, without access to frequent hot water, without a reliable fuel supply, you must make this day count. It's not even really your choice. No one wants to be the one who skips the annual bath. You'd be talked about for weeks, or were smelled. Even in a village that lives among pigs and dung, human filth stands apart. There's a sourness to it that no one speaks of, yet everyone recognizes. And so, reluctantly, nervously, you rise. The ritual of readiness. You began the day by gathering firewood. The stack has been prepared over the last few weeks, slowly, intentionally. It's good. Dry wood is scarce, and it must not be wasted. You cannot afford to have the fire go out halfway through the heating process that happened once to your cousin. and she had to bathe in cold water. Her joints ached all winter. She still curses her luck. Others in your household have their roles. The oldest daughter walks to the nearby stream and fills buckets one by one, laboring up the hill to carry them to the barn, which today will double as a bathhouse. The barn is the only space large enough to accommodate a family-sized tub. The animals are turned out for the day, their straw bedding replaced with wooden slats to keep your bare feet off the cold floor. You shovel ashes out of the iron stove, left over from last night's cooking fire. You stack the new wood in careful crisscross layers, driest on the bottom, damper pieces on top. You light the kindling with a bit of charcloth from your mother's sewing kit and sit back watching the flames catch. The heat builds slowly, enough to begin warming the great cauldron that hangs above the hearth. The cauldron is wide and black, older than you are. It has boiled stews, brewed dyes, even melted down beeswax for candle making. But today, it will hold water. It's gallons and gallons of water ladled into the waiting tub with great ceremony. There is no plumbing, no spout to twist. Leave patience, only muscle. A tub for 10 you. Do not bathe alone. This is another fact of the village, one never questioned. Privacy is a concept reserved for burial and childbirth. In life, especially on bath day, bodies are communal. The tub is wooden made of staves bound with iron band sand, just barely deep enough to sit in. It has no plug. You must dip water in and out with a ladle. The family bathes in order. First the father, then the mother, then the oldest to youngest. By the time it's your turn, the water has turned cloudy. Spits float in it. Hair, dirt, pieces of straw. But you say nothing. You step in with a wince. The heat is long gone. What was once almost too hot for the father is now barely lukewarm. You rub your arms briskly, pretending it still burns. There is no soap. Not really. It's not the fragrant kind used in towns. What you have is made from lard and ashes, mixed together months ago and left to harden in the cellar. It is brown, smells faintly of tallow and smoke. It does not lather. It is rubbed on the skin, scraped with a blunt knife, and rinsed with another bucket of water. Behind you, your little sister waits her turn, wrapped in a wool blanket. She watches the process with a mixture of boredom and dread. When you finish, you do not dry off. There are no towels. Instead, you stand near the stove and air dry, goosebumps racing across your arms and legs. The entire process takes hours. No one hurries. No one speaks loudly. There is a reverent quiet to it, as though you are all preparing to walk into a long, frozen tomb. And in some ways, you are. Winter will be long. Your body will ache. Your skin will crack and peel. This is the cleanest you will be for the next 5 months. Beyond the family, the village bathing order some families, richer than yours, own 2 tubs. Some share a tub with neighbors, alternating days. Some have clever arrangements. The men bathe 1 week, the women the next, but all follow the same annual rhythm. The smell of steam and boiled lye rises across the village like a shared offering. It clings to the trees, the fences, the thatched roofs. Children run around half-dressed, squealing from cold rinse buckets. Elders sit on stools by the fire, letting their joints loosen. You can hear laughter from the next house over. An older man grumbles about how water never stays hot long enough. A woman hums as she braids her daughter's clean hair for a single day. Everyone is both vulnerable and renewed. The baker, who spends his days dusted in flour, emerges from his home pink and shiny. The shepherd, usually matted with lanolin and wool grease, nods as he walks past, hair wet and combed for once. The old widow, who smells of cats and sour milk, even she scrubs her feet today. It is an unspoken agreement. Today, we are all the same. Tomorrow, you will return to your layers of grime, your smoky clothes, your rough hands. But for tonight, you'll sleep in clean sheets. Your skin will not itch from salt. Your hair will rest flat instead of coiled in grease. And in the dark, you will lie still and wonder, is this what it feels like to be someone else? Someone who bathes twice a week. Someone with a tiled room, running water, perfumed soap. Or would that much cleanliness start to feel dangerous? After bath day, the village changes. It's not dramatic. There are no banners, no feasts, no declarations. But there's something different in how people walk. Certain ease in their stride, a faint brightness to their expressions. Everyone knows they've done the thing that must be done, dared it, and now they're prepared. Because bath day isn't just about washing, it's about transition from the sweating, aching, grimy toil of harvest season into the tight huddle of winter survival. It's a kind of shedding. It's a release of the past year's labor, the field's dust, the animal stench, the sweat of long days under the sun. Bathing is how the village enters a state of dormancy. You are expected to hold on to that clean skin for months to come, layer by layer, once clean. The next step is protection, not just blankets or wool but layers of clothing that won't be removed again until spring. Linen undergarments, if your household owns any woolen tunics, double layered for the children. Fur-lined boots, if you're lucky, greased cloaks to repel snow, head coverings sewn from scraps of old skirts. These are your new second skin. Bath day signals the start of no more changing. Most villagers will not undress fully again for months. Perhaps a sleeve will be removed here or there, or a stocking swapped out, but full nudity. It's over until the next bath day comes round again. And yet, the irony is, these very layers meant to protect you also trap your filth. The body still sweats, the feet still blister. The lice, of course, return. Not immediately, it's a glorious window, perhaps a week, perhaps two, when the skin feels smooth and dry. But lice are not easily discouraged. They live in seams, in collars, in bedding, and they multiply. The church teaches that lice are reminders of the fall, tiny punishments for Eve's sin. It's said that monks and anchorites welcome them, refusing to kill them, considering them holy irritants. But here in the village, lice are just life, so you don't talk about it. You simply stop scratching in public. The longhouse winter as December deepens. The windows are shuttered. The doors are sealed with cloth, and families begin to cluster closer. The barn, which hosted your annual bath, now houses the most vulnerable livestock. Calves, hens, and the weakling piglet are brought inside. Their warmth is not wasted. The family shares sleeping space with them. You curl near the hearth, using your brother's bony shoulder as a pillow. Your little sister hogs the warmth of the dog, who lies beside her like a lumpy cushion. Your father snores. Somewhere in the rafters, a chicken scratches. Every breath in the room smells of hay, smoke, sweat, and sour milk. But beneath it all, faintly, is the memory of soap, of ash, of lye, of water poured slowly down your spine. That memory is important. You hold on to it because slowly, as the weeks pass, your body changes again. Your hair thickens with oil. Your skin dulls, cracks, flakes. Your hands split at the knuckles from cold, and then heal, and then split again. Your clothes become stiff with wear. Sometimes, in the silence of a deep snow day, you touch your arm and are startled by how rough it feels, how you've returned to being unwashed. It didn't happen all at once, but it's happened. You're now on the other side of bath day, and there is no going back. Cleanliness. It's superstition in town. They say bathing makes you weak. They say it opens the skin's pores and invites in bad air miasma. They call it. The rich may have tiled baths, scented soaps, even attendants to scrub their feet. But among the clergy, among doctors, and especially among midwives, bathing is risky. It's not that water is feared. It's exposure. To remove your clothes and open your pores is to make yourself vulnerable. Vulnerable to chills, to spirits, to bad humors. Okay, and so, over time, cleanliness becomes associated with danger. Here in the village, the opposite view lingers. Cleanliness is seen as too rare to be feared, too precious to be dismissed. But even so, superstition remains. For instance, no woman may bathe if she's pregnant. It's believed the water could drown the spirit of the child inside her. Elders will not bathe if they've been ill recently. It's said the shock of warm water can draw out the last breath of a dying man. Children must be watched during their rinse, not because they'll slip, but because it's believed fairies sometimes steal newly scrubbed infants, mistaking them for noble babes. And so bath day becomes not only a matter of health, but of ritual. Offerings may be left near the tub herbs. Iron scissors, crosses made from straw. Older women mutter blessings as water is poured. Fathers spit 3 times into the fire before stepping in. Children wear red strings around their wrists, tied tight during the bath and untied only after dark. No one says aloud what they fear, but they do the things their mothers taught them, and they pass those fears to you. The itch of remembering by February. You itch, not with disease, though that will come by with memory. You remember how warm the water was, how briefly the world felt. Still, you remember your sister's squeal when the rinse bucket hit her back. You remember the faint scent of boiled fat and soap. It's now gone from your skin, but still lodged in your mind. You remember the steam that rose to the rafters, the way your mother combed your hair afterward, the weight of the blanket she wrapped around your shoulders. You remember your father's silence, how he didn't speak at all that day, except to say, "Don't waste the water." Now that silence echoes. You understand it better. Bath day was not for talking. It was for remembering that you are a body, and that this body is temporary. The cost of clean. Not everyone makes it to the next bath day. Sometimes the winter takes the old. Sometimes childbirth takes the young. Sometimes an infected wound, a spilled lantern, or a deep cough that never leaves. When someone dies, they are cleaned again. Not bathed, not exactly, just wiped. The face is rinsed with warm water. The hands are folded. The family's kind or believes in luck. They'll change the dead's clothes for cleaner ones. But the village is small. Everyone knows that most of the clean clothes are just slightly less dirty. The body is buried quickly. The ground is hard, but the hole is dug. Okay? You, the living, return to the hearth and to your lairs. And again, you itch. A new kind of bathing. Late March, the thaw begins. Water trickles in the ditches. Snow shrinks. Children throw off mittens. And sometimes, when no one is looking, someone walks barefoot in the slush just to feel something. There is no second bath. Not yet, but there are secret rinses in the woods at the edge of the stream. Girls lift their skirts and wash their ankles. Boys splash water on their faces and chase each other laughing. Grandmothers rub herbs between their palms, trying to mask the smell of weeks of sweating. And for a moment, there is hope. It's not the bath, but it's a beginning. As you walk past the barn, still blackened from soot and months of firewood, smoke, you glance inside. Okay, the tub is there, empty, dry. A mouse scurries across the wooden slats. It waits, so do you. And you wonder, when bath day comes again, will it feel different? Will it still feel sacred? Or will the years wear it down into just another chore, like cleaning the chimney or scraping mud from the doorstep? Will you ever truly feel clean again? Clean again? Spring is not a clean season. It's a common misconception that the thaw brings purity, that the meltwater washes the land. The greening hills are somehow fresh. Anyone who's lived through a medieval spring knows it is the mud season. The snow recedes, revealing months of what was hidden. Animal waste, decaying straw, molded firewood, spoiled food stores. Dead rats, the dirt paths turn to black sludge, the thatch leaks, the roofs drip. Chickens scratch the filth and wander indoors. Children run barefoot through slop until their feet are blue with cold and caked with grime. There is no glory to spring, not in the village, not in the time between the end of freezing and the beginning of warmth. And yet, this is when the bath begins again, not physically, not yet, but in thought. The preparations are subtle. The soap maker begins boiling fats again, skimming the scum off bubbling cauldrons, while muttering complaints about how weak the lye is this season. Neighbor barters a broken comb for rosemary. Another whispers about fetching river reeds for scrubbing. None of this is urgent. No one says the bath is coming. But everyone knows counting the tubs bathing once a year is not a fixed rule. In some households, it is twice, rarely 3 times. If a woman births her child cleanly, she may be allowed a postpartum rinse. If a man survives a serious illness, the village healer may insist on a purifying wash. But these are exceptions, always granted cautiously. Often with ritual or prayer. Most tubs you see are broken, not in pieces, but in age. The great wash tub in the community barn is sturdy, thick oak planks held with iron bands, but private. Tubs, they are leaky, dry-rotted, worm-eaten. So, bathing becomes communal by necessity. You line up again. You wait your turn. You hope the water holds its warmth just long enough for your back to stop shivering. And yet, there is something almost ceremonial in this inconvenience, in the sharing, in the way children learn to wash their feet in silence, mimicking the way their mother scoops the water, or how their grandfather stares into the flame while the tub fills. You do not need instruction manuals when everyone's done it the same way for generations. You know when to ladle, you know when to scrub, you know when to be still. Water and work bath day is not a day off. There are no holidays tied to it. No church bells marking its coming. It is woven into the rhythm of toil. The men must still shear sheep, mend tools, patch fences. The women must bake, sweep, tend the sick. Children are still expected to run errands, fetch water, feed animals. But the bath overlays all of it. It hums. Beneath each conversation, will the fire be hot enough this year? Who's bringing soap? Who gets in first? The village elder claims he remembers a year when the bath was skipped. It was the plague. Everyone feared sharing water. Even warm water. The sick coughed blood into buckets. The well was left untapped. That spring, the smell was different. Not just of sweat and dirt, but of grief. That year, no one bathed. That year, no one talked about the bath at all. It became clear, bathing was not just about skin. It was about life, continuing. So now, even in hard years, the bath returns. Tools of the bath in modern times. A bath involves items, scented soaps, soft towels, bottles of shampoo. But here, the tools are humble. A bar of lye, soapy low brown, hardened like stone. A jug of rainwater, warmed by the sun. A handful of dried moss used for scrubbing soles. A wooden ladle carved with initials long faded. A comb missing 2 teeth. A worn cloth dipped and wrung again and again. Sometimes someone brings flowers, not for scent, but for warding off spirits. Coltsfoot, primrose, and marigold. The healer might burn sage or rosemary over the water to bless the bones, though no one agrees exactly what that means. Each item is passed around. Everyone uses the same soap, the same bucket, the same silence, because here, privacy is non-existent, and yet bears more dignity in this ritual than in any noble's gilded chamber. Because here, in this forgotten corner of the world, you earned your bath, not as leisure, but as survival. Skin and memory. Your skin is not the same as it was before. It has learned to live with dirt. It has thickened. dried, and flaked through frost. It has borne lice, soot, and sores. It has healed. It is cracked again. It is darkened in the sun and stiffened in the cold dot now. As the water soaks it once more, you feel something stir beneath the surface, something deeper than cleanliness. Memory of last year's bath, of the one before that, of the time your sister sang through the rinse, of the moment your mother wiped your back without a word, and you felt like crying. The water is not warm enough, but it is enough. You do not speak. No one does, because the bath is not for conversation. It is for remembering that you are still here, that somehow, through storm and famine and fatigue, your body has carried you, and for a few minutes each year, it is allowed to be only a body, not a laborer, not a mother, not a tenant, just flesh and breath. The last, ladle, the final rinse is always the same. You hold your breath. You lean forward. You let the water fall. Not too quickly, no splashing, just a slow, steady pour. The ash soap runs down your spine. The dirt lifts. You rise. You do not dry yourself fully. There is no towel thick enough. Not really. You pat. And then you dress in clean clothes set aside long ago and folded under your bed. They smell of wood smoke in time. You feel unfamiliar in them. Lighter, even though the garments are rough spun and patched. They cling differently to a clean frame. For a moment, you think, maybe this is what nobility feels like, but you know better. Nobility bathe with rose water and almond oil. You smell faintly of lard and lye. Still, it is enough. After the bath later that night, the house is quiet. The fire burns low. Your family lies in their usual places, layered under blankets, layered in each other's warmth, but everyone smells fresher. The hay doesn't seem as sour. The dog doesn't stink. It's quite as bad. Even the air feels changed. Your skin prickles in the cool, but you are dry and clean, still a little damp at the roots of your hair. You pull the blanket closer, and you sleep. A question that stays when people from the future look back. They might laugh at the idea of annual bathing, at the shared tubs and the communal soap, at the soot-smeared bodies pressed together in a wooden shed. But would they survive it? Could they endure the seasons between baths? Could they learn to scratch without drawing blood? Could they wash their skin with one bucket of water and a prayer? Could they go a year with nothing but a single moment of true cleanliness? Or has comfort made them too soft to understand the power of the bath? And even if they could endure it, would they find the sacredness in the silence of that water?